Today, Jesus gives us a parable talking about the sins of greed and covetousness. You're watching At the Pastor's Desk. Today we'll be looking at Jesus' parable of the rich fool, which is found exclusively in Luke's Gospel. It's in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. Just like in previous parables, Jesus gives this parable in response to someone else. In this case, it's in response to this man who wants to split the inheritance with his brother. Jesus then responds with the parable. Let's go ahead and read and see what he says. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." So this man comes before Jesus and tells him, hey, you need to make my brother, presumably the older brother who would have gotten the inheritance, to split the inheritance with him. Doesn't give a reason, just says you need to convince him to do this. And Jesus says, "Who made me the arbitrator over you, the judge over you?" Which is kind of ironic because Jesus will be the judge at the end time. But he poses this question and then turns to the crowd and gives this summary statement of what the parable will be about. He tells them to be on guard against all covetousness. One's life does not consist of the things that you own. He then goes on to tell this parable of the rich fool to further his point. And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" So in this parable, there's this man who has a farm of some kind, and it produces plentifully. It makes even more than he can store in his barns. And so to fix this problem, he tears down his barns and builds bigger ones so he can store it all. But then God comes and speaks to him and says, "You're a fool. It doesn't matter what you've built up for yourself to store for yourself. Your life is going to be taken from you this night. And what good is your stuff going to do now?" And then Jesus gives the statement at the end saying, "Don't store up treasure for yourself, but rather be rich toward God." Now there's a couple of things that you should note in reading this parable. We've already hit on the first one, and that's Jesus saying to guard against covetousness. And this parable shows that this man is coveting more for himself. He wants to keep these things to himself, and so he builds these barns so that he'll have enough, more than enough, for himself, so he doesn't have to worry. One of the big things to pick up in this parable that really helps understand the interpretation is this man's use of personal pronouns. Because on the face of this parable, it doesn't seem like a bad thing to say, "Oh, I don't have enough barn space to keep all of this harvest, so I should make bigger barns." It seems like a pretty logical and, in fact, intelligent thing to do. But Jesus says that it was a bad thing for this man to do, that he was coveting. That's what the first point he makes is. But looking at how he describes these things, and specifically whom these things belong to. Notice he's constantly saying that these are my things and that I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, my harvest, my soul. He thinks that they're all his, that they belong to him, and so he can do whatever he wants. Now the key here in this parable is that he thinks they're all his, but they're not. All of these things are gifts of God. God has provided the harvest. God has provided him the very barns to fill his harvest with. And ultimately, even the gift of his own life belongs to God, which God can take away at any moment. And so all of these things that he is so arrogantly believing are his and that he's worked hard to do, they all are gifts of God and they belong to God. And that takes us to the end of the parable where Jesus gives that statement that you should be rich towards God and not be coveting things for yourself and storing up treasures only for you. And so what does it mean to be rich towards God? Well, it means a couple things. First is to acknowledge that everything belongs to God. You don't need to be selfish and thinking that you have done all this hard work to gain things for yourself. No, everything belongs to God. Your job is a gift of God. The money you make is a gift of God. The very air you breathe is a gift of God. Your life is a gift of God. Everything belongs to God, and God is the one who gives those things to you. And so, being rich towards God, first, acknowledge that it's His and be thankful for that. Second is to use these things that God has given you to serve your neighbor. In Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, which we'll get to in a future video, in part talks about serving your neighbor and how when you serve others, you serve God. In Matthew 25:40, the king in this parable says, "Whatever you did for the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." And so in serving your neighbor, you are serving God. And so this is part of being rich towards God, acknowledging that the things given to you are God's, and secondly, to love your neighbor and serve your neighbor with those things of God. And thirdly, from a church perspective, this brings to mind the tithe, that because God has given us all of these things, we give a tithe back to God, a thanks offering to God, usually around 10% of what you make, as thanksgiving to God that He has provided you with all of these things, everything you have. And so we give back to God just a small portion of it, even though God has given us everything. We give that tithe back to God out of thanks for what He has done for us. And so this parable is quite simple. Its message is don't covet things for yourself. Don't consider everything you have to be your own, that you've earned it or anything like that. Realize that all of these things belong to God and that He has so graciously given you these things. And so the least you can do is acknowledge and thank God for those things, but then also with what you are able to serve your neighbor, to give to charity, to love your neighbor as Christ has loved you. And this is what being Christian is about. This is a way that we as Christians can show our faith, like James talks about, in serving our neighbor. Thanks for watching. If you've missed any of our videos, check out our YouTube channel. You can find all of our previous videos there, including parables and other series that we've done. Go ahead and subscribe to our channel, hit the notification button so you get notified when these videos come up. If you have friends or family members who might enjoy watching these videos, go ahead and share it with them too. This is for anyone who listens. So go ahead and share those with anyone who might benefit from hearing these as well. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next week. God bless.